On the morning of August 28, 1945, 13 days after the Emperor's voice crackled through radio speakers announcing the end of hostilities, a convoy of American transport trucks rumbled along the coastal road toward the fishing village of Katsura, located approximately 100 kilometers southeast of Tokyo. The late summer air hung thick with humidity, carrying the salt-tinged breeze from the Pacific Ocean, while cicadas screamed their endless chorus from the pine forests lining the hillsides. In the lead vehicle sat Sergeant First Class William "Billy" Reeves of the 11th Airborne Division, a 24-year-old from rural Tennessee who had spent the previous 3 years island hopping across the Pacific, and who now found himself participating in an occupation that every briefing officer had warned would likely cost thousands of American lives. The Japanese, they had been told repeatedly, would fight to the last man, woman, and child. Mothers would strap explosives to their babies. Grandfathers would charge with bamboo spears. The civilian population had been so thoroughly indoctrinated by years of propaganda that they would choose mass suicide over the shame of surrender. Sergeant Reeves gripped his rifle tighter as the convoy crested a hill and the village came into view, its traditional wooden houses clustered around a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the morning tide. He fully expected that within the hour he would be engaged in close-quarters urban combat, the kind of brutal house-to-house fighting that had claimed so many of his friends on Luzon. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, as it really helps support the channel. What actually happened in Katsura that morning, and in thousands of similar encounters across Japan in the weeks and months that followed, would fundamentally transform not only the expectations of the occupying forces, but also the deeply held beliefs of the Japanese civilians themselves. This is the story of how something as simple as a chocolate bar became a powerful symbol of unexpected mercy, and how that mercy sparked one of the most remarkable psychological transformations in modern history. To understand the magnitude of what occurred, we must first comprehend the depth of fear that gripped the Japanese civilian population in August 1945. For years, the Imperial Japanese government had conducted an extensive propaganda campaign designed to prepare the population for an Allied invasion that military planners believed was inevitable. Pamphlets distributed in schools and workplaces described American soldiers as demonic creatures who would commit unspeakable acts against women and children. Radio broadcasts warned that the Americans would systematically execute all Japanese males and enslave the female population. Newspapers published fabricated accounts of atrocities supposedly committed against Japanese prisoners, though in reality, many of these stories were projections of actual events that had occurred in reverse. Tomiko Watanabe was 16 years old in the summer of 1945, living with her widowed mother and 2 younger brothers in the village of Katsura. Her father, a fisherman, had been conscripted into the Imperial Navy in 1943 and was reported missing following a naval engagement near the Philippines. In the weeks leading up to the surrender, Tomiko had participated in mandatory civil defense training, during which local officials distributed sharpened bamboo stakes to women and children and instructed them on the proper technique for attacking American soldiers. She had also attended assemblies where village leaders explained that honorable self-termination was preferable to capture, and that those who submitted to occupation would bring eternal shame upon their ancestors. When word reached Katsura that American forces would be arriving on August 28th, Tomiko's mother made the decision that would save her family's lives. Rather than following the instructions to hide in the mountains or prepare for a final defense, Yuki Watanabe gathered her children and told them they would remain in their home. Having traveled to Yokohama as a young woman and briefly worked in a hotel that served Western guests, she possessed a perspective that few in the village shared. She remembered the American businessmen and tourists as generally polite, if somewhat loud and informal. She could not reconcile those memories with the monsters described in the propaganda, and she made a calculated decision to trust her own experience over the official narrative. Still, even Yuki Watanabe felt her hands tremble as the rumble of truck engines grew louder that morning. She instructed Tomiko to take her brothers, 8-year-old Kenji and 5-year-old Hiroshi, and sit quietly in the main room of their house. She prepared tea, though she did not know if the Americans would drink it. She placed a small vase of wildflowers on the low table, a gesture of normalcy in a moment that felt anything but normal. And then they waited, listening to the sounds of heavy vehicles stopping in the village center, doors opening and closing, and unfamiliar voices speaking in a language that sounded harsh and clipped to their ears. Sergeant Billy Reeves was among the first American soldiers to dismount from the convoy. His unit had been assigned to secure the village and establish a temporary command post in preparation for the broader occupation of the Chiba prefecture. He had been given specific orders regarding civilian interaction, orders that reflected a dramatic shift in American military thinking that had occurred in the final weeks of the conflict. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, had issued directives emphasizing that the occupation would succeed only through winning the trust and cooperation of the Japanese people. Punitive measures and harsh treatment would breed resentment and resistance. Generosity and fairness, MacArthur believed, would accomplish what military force alone could not. To this end, American soldiers had been supplied with items specifically intended for distribution to Japanese civilians. Reeves carried in his pack several dozen chocolate bars, packages of chewing gum, hard candies, and small bags of sugar. He had also been given a phonetic card with basic Japanese phrases, though his Tennessee accent rendered most of them incomprehensible. As he walked through the eerily quiet streets of Katsura, past shuttered windows and closed doors, he felt like he was moving through a ghost town. Where was everyone? Had they fled? Were they preparing an ambush? The first civilian Reeves encountered was an elderly man named Genzo Yamamoto, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who had made his own decision to remain visible. Yamamoto had studied English as a young man and had spent several years teaching at a school in Kobe that served the children of foreign merchants. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the village, that the coming days would require someone to serve as an intermediary between the occupiers and the occupied. As Reeves approached, rifle at the ready, Yamamoto bowed deeply and spoke in careful, formal English that he had not used in nearly 2 decades. The American soldier was so surprised to hear his own language that he nearly dropped his weapon. According to the account he would later provide to military historians, Reeves simply stared at the old man for several seconds, his mind struggling to reconcile the dignified, bowing figure before him with the fanatical enemy he had been trained to expect. Yamamoto, interpreting the silence as suspicion, spoke again, explaining that he was a retired teacher, that the village was peaceful, and that the people were frightened but would not cause trouble. Reeves finally found his voice and asked if there were any military personnel in the area. Yamamoto assured him there were not. It was at this moment that Reeves made a decision that would be replicated countless times across Japan in the following weeks. He reached into his pack, withdrew a Hershey chocolate bar, and held it out to the elderly Japanese man. Yamamoto stared at the offering, his weathered face cycling through a complex series of emotions that observers would later describe as confusion, suspicion, recognition, and finally, something approaching wonder. In the Japan of 1945, chocolate was an almost mythical luxury. The country's confectionery industry had been entirely converted to military production years earlier, and sugar itself had been strictly rationed. Most children under the age of 10 had never tasted chocolate in their lives. Yamamoto accepted the bar with both hands, bowing again, more deeply this time. He later recalled that the moment felt profoundly disorienting, as though he had stepped into an alternate reality where nothing operated according to the rules he had known. Here was an enemy soldier, armed and dangerous, standing in his village as a conqueror, and his first action was to offer a gift, not a demand, not a threat. A gift. Yamamoto thanked the American in English, and then, after a moment of hesitation, asked if he might share the chocolate with the children of the village. Reeves smiled and handed over several more bars, along with packets of chewing gum. He then asked Yamamoto to help him communicate with the other villagers, to assure them that they would not be harmed. What followed was a scene that would be repeated in fishing villages and farming communities, in urban neighborhoods and mountain hamlets throughout the Japanese home islands. Word spread through Katsura that the Americans were distributing food rather than carrying out executions. Slowly, cautiously, doors began to open. Faces appeared in windows. Children, driven by curiosity that overpowered their fear, crept closer to the foreign soldiers with their strange uniforms and incomprehensible language. When a young private named Thomas McCarthy knelt down and held out a piece of candy to a group of children, the youngest of them, a girl of perhaps 4 years, toddled forward and accepted it before her terrified mother could stop her. The child put the candy in her mouth, and her face transformed into an expression of pure delight. She had never tasted anything like it. Tomiko Watanabe watched this scene unfold from the doorway of her family's house, her younger brothers clinging to her legs. She would later describe the experience as feeling like waking from a nightmare, to discover that the monsters were not monsters at all. When an American soldier approached their house, her mother stepped forward and bowed politely. The soldier, a corporal from Ohio named James Sullivan, removed his helmet and bowed back, a gesture that shocked the entire family. He then reached into his pack and produced 3 chocolate bars, one for each of the children. Tomiko's hands shook as she accepted the gift. She had tasted chocolate once before in her life, at a festival in Chiba when she was 9 years old, and the memory of that sweetness had stayed with her through all the bitter years of deprivation and loss. The psychological impact of these encounters cannot be overstated. For the Japanese civilians who experienced them, the cognitive dissonance was profound and immediate. They had been prepared for a specific kind of enemy, one that would validate the years of propaganda and justify the tremendous sacrifices the nation had made. Instead, they encountered young men who smiled at children, who offered gifts freely, and who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the fear they inspired. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier who served as a translator during the occupation, later reflected that he could see the exact moment when people's beliefs began to crack. Their eyes would change, he said. You could see them realizing that everything they had been told was wrong. This realization was not merely an intellectual adjustment. It struck at the very foundations of trust that had bound Japanese society together through the hardships of the conflict. If the government had deceived them about the nature of the enemy, what else had been lies? If the Americans were not demons, then perhaps the conflict itself had not been the noble struggle they had been told it was. These thoughts were dangerous, destabilizing, and yet they spread through the population with remarkable speed. Within weeks of the initial occupation, Japanese civilians were not merely tolerating the American presence, but actively seeking interaction with the foreign soldiers. Children would run toward military convoys shouting the English words they had learned, primarily chocolate, candy, and hello. Adults would bring gifts of vegetables and fish to the soldiers stationed near their communities, gestures of gratitude that often moved the young Americans to tears. The transformation was particularly striking in the children, who adapted to the new reality with a flexibility that their elders could not match. Kenji and Hiroshi Watanabe, Tomiko's younger brothers, quickly overcame their initial terror and began following the American soldiers around the village like eager puppies. The soldiers, many of whom had younger siblings back home in places like Indiana and California and New York, responded to this attention with an enthusiasm that exceeded their official duties. They organized informal games of catch using equipment from their supplies. They handed out magazines and comic books that the children could not read but found endlessly fascinating. They learned a few words of Japanese, mostly incorrectly pronounced, and laughed along with the children at their mistakes. Corporal James Sullivan became a particular favorite of the Watanabe family. He visited their home regularly during his posting in Katsura, bringing not only chocolate and candy, but also practical supplies that the family desperately needed, including soap, canned goods, and fabric that Yuki Watanabe could use to make clothing for her growing sons. He showed Tomiko photographs of his family in Cleveland, his parents and 3 sisters who wrote him letters every week. She showed him a photograph of her father in his naval uniform, and Sullivan bowed his head respectfully. He did not speak of the conflict or attempt to assign blame. He simply acknowledged the loss, one human being recognizing the grief of another. These individual relationships were multiplied across the entire nation. By the end of 1945, More than 350,000 American military personnel were stationed throughout Japan, and their daily interactions with civilians created countless opportunities for the kind of personal connection that no official policy could mandate. The occupation authorities provided a framework, distributing food aid and medical supplies, establishing fair labor practices, and prosecuting those who engaged in misconduct. But it was the ordinary soldiers, the sergeants and corporals and privates who handed out chocolate bars and played with children, and showed photographs of their families, who did the real work of transforming enemy into friend. Genzo Yamamoto, the retired English teacher, became an invaluable asset to the occupation forces in Katsura. He served as a translator and cultural liaison, helping the Americans understand local customs and helping the villagers understand American intentions. He organized English classes for children and adults, recognizing that language would be essential to the new relationship between the two nations. He also kept a detailed journal of his experiences during the occupation, a document that would later be donated to a university archive and become a primary source for historians studying the period. In one entry dated September 15, 1945, Yamamoto wrote about a conversation he had with Sergeant Reeves, the first American he had encountered. They sat together on the seawall near the harbor, watching fishing boats return with their catch, and Reeves asked why the Japanese people had not resisted the occupation more fiercely. Yamamoto considered the question carefully before responding. He explained that the Japanese people were not cowards, but they were also not fools. They had been prepared to endure enormous suffering in defense of their homeland, but they had been prepared for an enemy that did not arrive. Instead of monsters, they found young men who missed their mothers and liked to share candy with children. Against such an enemy, Yamamoto said, there could be no resistance, only surrender. Reeves was quiet for a long moment after this explanation. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a Hershey bar, broke it in half and offered one piece to the old teacher. They sat together in comfortable silence, two former enemies sharing chocolate as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. This image, this simple scene of shared humanity, captures the essence of what occurred during the occupation of Japan. It was not a story of conquest and submission, but of transformation and reconciliation. And it began in countless places and countless ways with the offering of a gift. The women of Japan experienced the occupation with a particular intensity of relief. The propaganda had reserved its most horrific warnings for female civilians, describing in graphic terms the fate that awaited them at the hands of American soldiers. Mothers had hidden daughters. Young women had disguised themselves as old crones or prepared methods of self-harm to avoid capture. The reality of the occupation rendered these preparations unnecessary, and the fears that prompted them shameful in retrospect. While there were incidents of misconduct, they were relatively rare and were prosecuted vigorously by American military authorities. The official policy of respect for Japanese women was reinforced by the behavior of most soldiers, who conducted themselves with a propriety that surprised and gradually reassured the female population. Yuki Watanabe later spoke about this transformation in her own thinking. She had spent the final months of the conflict preparing herself for the worst, making plans for her daughter that no mother should have to contemplate. When those plans proved unnecessary, she felt a release of tension so profound that she wept for 2 days. She also felt a deep anger toward the officials who had subjected her and her children to such needless terror. This anger was shared by many Japanese civilians, and it contributed to a broader reassessment of the government that had led them into the conflict. If they had been deceived about the enemy, they reasoned, perhaps they had been deceived about everything. The chocolate bars and candy that American soldiers distributed became symbols of this deception and its unraveling. To the children who received them, they were simply delicious treats, windows into a world of abundance and sweetness that they had never known. To the adults who watched these distributions, they carried a more complex meaning. Each chocolate bar was evidence that the Americans possessed resources so vast that they could afford to give away luxuries to conquered civilians. Each piece of candy was proof that the enemy was not the ravenous beast of propaganda, but a society of such prosperity that its soldiers carried sweets in their pockets. The psychological impact of this abundance was almost as powerful as the kindness with which it was shared. Captain Harold Peters, a logistics officer who helped coordinate supply distribution during the occupation, later reflected on the strategic importance of these seemingly trivial items. He explained that the chocolate and candy served multiple purposes simultaneously. They built goodwill with the civilian population, particularly with children, who would grow up with positive associations with America. They demonstrated American wealth and industrial capacity, subtly undermining any remaining belief in the viability of resistance. And they gave individual soldiers a way to connect with Japanese civilians on a personal level, transforming the occupation from an abstract military operation into a series of human relationships. "We did not conquer Japan with weapons," Peters said. "We conquered it with chocolate bars." This assessment, while perhaps oversimplified, contains a fundamental truth about the occupation. The military power that had compelled Japan's surrender was never really in question. The Americans could have ruled by force, imposing their will through intimidation and punishment. Instead, they chose a different path, one that recognized the humanity of the defeated population and sought to build cooperation rather than demand submission. This choice was not universally supported at the time. Many Americans, their grief and anger over the conflict still raw, believed that Japan deserved harsh treatment. But MacArthur and his planners understood that harshness would breed resentment, and resentment would breed resistance, and resistance would require a permanent military presence that the United States could not afford and did not want. The success of this approach became evident with remarkable speed. By early 1946, American soldiers were moving through Japanese cities and villages without armed escorts, a level of security that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Japanese civilians were providing information to occupation authorities, reporting misconduct by both their own countrymen and American personnel, a degree of cooperation that reflected genuine trust rather than mere compliance. And everywhere, children were running after jeeps and trucks, calling out for chocolate and chewing gum, their faces alight with excitement rather than fear. These children, the generation that experienced the occupation firsthand, would grow up to lead Japan's remarkable transformation into an economic powerhouse and a stable democracy. Tomiko Watanabe was among this generation, and her life traced the arc of Japan's post-war transformation. She completed her education at a school that had been reorganized under occupation guidelines to emphasize critical thinking rather than rote obedience. She learned English, initially from Genzo Yamamoto, and later from courses taught by American instructors. She found employment at a trading company in Tokyo that conducted business with American firms, and she eventually rose to a management position, a career trajectory that would have been unimaginable for a woman in pre-war Japan. She married a man she chose herself, rather than accepting an arrangement made by her family, another freedom that the occupation had helped normalize. Throughout her life, Tomiko kept the wrapper from the first chocolate bar she received from Corporal Sullivan, the one he gave her on that August morning in Katsura. It was a simple piece of paper, brown and silver, with the Hershey name printed in English letters. She stored it in a small box along with other treasures, including her father's photograph and letters from Sullivan that he sent for several years after returning to America. When she showed this wrapper to her own children, she told them that it represented the moment when the future changed. Not just her future, but the future of the entire nation. It was the moment, she said, when we learned that our enemies were not what we had been told, and that we did not have to be what we had been told either. The broader implications of the chocolate bar diplomacy extended far beyond individual transformations. The occupation of Japan became a model for American foreign policy, demonstrating that generosity and respect could achieve objectives that military force alone could not. The Marshall Plan in Europe drew upon lessons learned in Japan, emphasizing economic assistance and institution building rather than punishment and extraction. The Cold War strategy of winning hearts and minds was directly influenced by the occupation experience, as policymakers recognized that ideological competition required more than weapons and threats. The United States had discovered, in the ruins of Japan, a truth that would shape its global posture for generations, that the most durable victories are won through kindness, not cruelty. In Japan itself, the occupation left a complex legacy. Many Japanese people felt genuine gratitude toward the Americans who had treated them with unexpected decency. And this gratitude translated into a strong alliance that has endured for more than 7 decades. At the same time, the occupation also planted seeds of dependence and self-doubt, as the Japanese people struggled to reconcile their traditional values with the imposed reforms and to understand how their leaders had led them so catastrophically astray. The memory of the chocolate bars thus carries both sweetness and bitterness, representing both the kindness of former enemies and the deceptions of former leaders. Genzo Yamamoto lived until 1968, long enough to see Japan's emergence as a major industrial power and its acceptance into the international community. In his final years, he often spoke about the morning when the Americans arrived in Katsura and about the chocolate bar that Sergeant Reeves offered him. He said that the gift had taught him something important about human nature. People are not determined by their nations or their uniforms, he explained. They are determined by their choices. And in that moment, Sergeant Reeves chose to be kind. That choice changed everything. Reeves himself returned to Tennessee after his discharge in 1946 and spent his career working for a manufacturing company in Knoxville. He rarely spoke about his service in the Pacific, and when he did, he focused not on combat, but on the occupation. He told his children and grandchildren about the old man who spoke English, about the children who followed him around the village, about the young woman who cried when he gave her brothers chocolate bars. He said that those memories were more important to him than anything that had come before, because they showed him what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. The Watanabe family remained in Katsura for several years after the surrender, before relocating to Tokyo, where Yuki found work in a hospital, and her children attended newly reformed schools. Kenji eventually became an engineer for an automobile company, part of the generation that built Japan's export economy. Hiroshi studied medicine and became a physician, serving communities in rural areas that struggled to attract healthcare professionals. Both men credited the occupation with shaping their worldview, teaching them that cooperation and exchange could accomplish more than isolation and conflict. They remembered the American soldiers fondly, not as conquerors, but as the first foreigners they had ever met. Young men who shared candy and played games, and showed them that the world beyond Japan was not the hostile wasteland they had been taught to fear. The institutional effects of the occupation were equally profound. The new constitution, drafted under American supervision, established principles of democracy and human rights that had no precedent in Japanese history. Land reform broke up the great estates and created a class of independent farmers. Labor laws protected workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. Educational reforms transformed schools from instruments of indoctrination into institutions of genuine learning. These changes were controversial at the time and remain subjects of debate among historians, but their overall impact was to create a society more open, more equal, and more prosperous than anything that had existed before. The symbolism of the chocolate bar endured long after the occupation ended in 1952. In Japanese popular culture, the image of American soldiers distributing candy to children became a standard representation of the immediate post-war period, appearing in films, television programs, and memoirs. The phrase "give me chocolate," rendered in English but pronounced with Japanese phonetics, became a catchphrase that evoked both the deprivation of the era and the relief that followed. For generations of Japanese people, the chocolate bar represented a turning point, the moment when defeat transformed into opportunity and former enemies became unexpected benefactors. This symbolism was not without its complications. Some Japanese intellectuals criticized the chocolate bar narrative as too simplistic, arguing that it obscured the suffering of the conflict, the legitimate grievances that Japan might have held against Western imperialism, and the self-interested motivations behind American generosity. These critiques contained valid points, but they did not negate the lived experience of millions of Japanese civilians for whom the chocolate bars were genuinely meaningful. For a hungry child in a devastated village, the distinction between selfless kindness and strategic benevolence was irrelevant. The chocolate was sweet, and the soldier who gave it smiled, and that was enough. The occupation also left its mark on American soldiers, many of whom found their views transformed by their experiences in Japan. They had arrived expecting fanatics and found frightened families. They had prepared for combat and found themselves playing with children. The disconnect between expectation and reality forced a reconsideration of attitudes toward the Japanese people specifically and toward former enemies generally. Many veterans returned home with a nuanced understanding of the conflict and its aftermath, recognizing that the Japanese civilians they had met were not fundamentally different from their own families and neighbors. This understanding contributed to a broader shift in American attitudes, supporting the policy of reconciliation rather than retribution. In the village of Katsura, the post-war years brought gradual recovery and modernization. The harbor was improved, allowing larger fishing boats to operate and increasing the catch. Electricity reached homes that had relied on oil lamps. Roads were paved, connecting the village to the broader transportation network. A new school was built, replacing the structure that had been damaged during the conflict. Through all these changes, the village retained its essential character, a quiet fishing community where families had lived for generations. But the memories of August 1945 remained fresh, passed down from parents to children, as a reminder of how quickly the world could change and how unexpectedly kindness could emerge from the shadow of fear. Tomiko Watanabe returned to Katsura many times during her life, visiting her mother until Yuki's passing in 1973, and later bringing her own children to see the place where she had grown up. She would walk along the seawall where Reeves and Yamamoto had sat sharing chocolate, and she would tell her children about that morning when the convoy arrived and everything began to transform. She would describe her fear and her mother's courage, the kindness of Corporal Sullivan, and the wisdom of old Yamamoto, and she would show them the harbor and the hills and the streets of the village, explaining that this ordinary place had been the site of something extraordinary, a moment when enemies became friends and despair became hope. In 1985, 40 years after the end of hostilities, Tomiko participated in a reunion event organized by a cultural exchange group. Former American servicemen who had participated in the occupation were invited to return to Japan and meet with Japanese civilians who had lived through that period. Sullivan had passed away several years earlier, but Tomiko met other veterans who had served in similar capacities, distributing food and supplies and building relationships with local communities. She thanked them for their kindness and told them what their actions had meant to her and to her family. Several of the veterans wept openly, overwhelmed by the gratitude of this elegant Japanese woman who had once been a frightened teenage girl accepting a chocolate bar from a stranger. The event received considerable media coverage in both Japan and the United States, and it sparked a broader public discussion about the legacy of the occupation. Historians debated the motivations and methods of American policymakers. Politicians invoked the occupation as a model for contemporary interventions with varying degrees of accuracy and appropriateness. But for the participants themselves, the reunion was personal rather than political. It was a chance to acknowledge what had happened, to express gratitude and receive forgiveness, to close circles that had remained open for 4 decades. It was, in its way, another exchange of gifts, as meaningful as the first chocolate bars had been. The story of the occupation cannot be reduced to chocolate bars alone. It encompassed tremendous complexity, including political maneuvering, economic calculation, cultural negotiation, and countless individual decisions that shaped the outcome in ways both large and small. But the chocolate bars serve as a powerful symbol precisely because they capture something essential about what occurred. They represent the choice to offer rather than to take, to build trust rather than to inspire fear, to recognize the humanity of former enemies and to act accordingly. They remind us that the aftermath of conflict is not predetermined, that people can choose reconciliation over revenge, and that such choices can transform not only individual lives, but entire nations. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Specifically, what part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second Global Conflict, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.